The first hard freeze came down over Gallatin County with the kind of cold that changed the sound of everything. It made snow squeak under tires instead of crunch. It made the pine trees stand motionless, as if even the wind had decided not to waste energy. It made the stars look sharper above the mountains, bright enough to feel close. And in the black hours before dawn, with the county mostly asleep behind locked doors and dark windows, it made the silence on Ethan Cole's radio feel heavier than usual. He drove with one hand steady on the wheel and the other resting near the console, eyes moving between the road, the tree line, and the digital map fixed to the dash. The county SUV climbed a narrow service road that curled toward the high ridge like a scar across the mountain. Snow from the previous day still lay thick on either side, glowing pale in the headlights. Beyond that beam, the forest disappeared into a wall of ink and frost. Shadow sat upright in the rear tactical compartment, broad head angled slightly toward the side window, ears forward. He was still as stone except for the slow fog of his breath on the glass. To anyone who didn't know working dogs, he might have looked calm. Ethan knew better. Stillness in Shadow often meant concentration. The dog's entire body seemed to narrow when he was listening, focusing, sorting the world through scent, sound, and instinct while human beings were still trying to decide what mattered. The radio hissed once, then cracked to life. "Cole, status." Captain Maria Hayes' voice came through, clipped and clear. Even over county frequency, even at 4:30 in the morning, she sounded like someone who had already thought 3 moves ahead. 3 minutes out, Ethan said. His voice was low, even, the sort that never needed to rise to be heard. He kept his eyes on the road as the SUV rounded a bend where ice shone like glass over buried gravel. "Signal still active?" he asked. "For now," Maria replied, repeating from the same coordinates, which still shouldn't be possible. Ethan glanced at the screen again. The emergency beacon pulsed red from the high elevation marker ahead. Lookout 17, a decommissioned fire tower shut down 8 years earlier after lightning damage and budget cuts. No permanent power, no active repeater, no staff. And yet the beacon had gone live at 3:57 and stayed live. "Any weather change?" Ethan asked. A beat of static. "Lena says pressure is dropping faster than forecast. You've got maybe 4 hours before the front closes the ridge." Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. 4 hours in the mountains could mean plenty or nothing at all. "Copy." He clicked the radio off and drove the last stretch without speaking. He preferred it that way. Words had their use. He understood that. But in the field, words were often what people used when they were trying to outrun the truth of a situation. Ethan had spent too many years learning that reality usually announced itself quietly. A change in air pressure, a bird line lifting out of timber, a dog that stopped breathing through his mouth and started working through his nose. He checked the mirror. Shadow's amber eyes met his for half a second. "We'll take it clean," Ethan said. Shadow gave no outward response, but Ethan saw the subtle shift in the dog's posture. Readiness, anticipation, not excitement, something sharper than that. A minute later the trees opened, and the outline of the lookout emerged above the snow. It stood on a shelf of rock at the ridge edge, half swallowed by darkness and winter. The old tower was ugly in the headlights, all black timbers and cross-bracing, the stairs cut away years ago after the closure. A squat utility shed leaned beside it, roof sagging under old snow. Frost silvered every exposed surface. The whole site looked dead. Yet a weak red pulse flashed from the tower platform above, steady as a heartbeat. Ethan killed the engine. Silence fell so completely that the ticking motor sounded loud. For a moment he stayed where he was, hand still on the wheel, scanning. Tree line, snowpack, utility shed, tower supports, ridge drop. No visible tracks from the road approach except wind-softened deer prints crossing near the rocks. No light from within the tower, no movement. He opened his door. The cold hit like a blade to the lungs. Shadow was out before the second door latch finished clicking, landing in the snow with a muted thud. His black and tan coat almost vanished against the dark as he moved forward on a short lead, head low, body controlled. Ethan closed the door softly and listened. Nothing but the distant strain of metal from the tower in the freeze and the faint hiss of dry snow shifting over rock. "Search." Shadow moved, not fast, not reckless. He began at the obvious line first, circling the utility shed, nose sweeping along the drift edge where wind had piled powder against the boards. Ethan followed with a flashlight kept low and shielded, letting the beam slide across surfaces instead of stabbing the dark. The dog passed the shed door, paused, returned. His head came up slightly, then down again. He inhaled once, twice, more sharply. Ethan shortened the lead without tugging. "What do you have?" Shadow's body changed. The motion was subtle, almost invisible if you didn't know him. The weight shifting forward, spine aligning, tail going still. He left the shed entirely and moved toward the tower supports, weaving between the frozen footings as if following a thread beneath the layered scent of timber, oil, ice, and old metal. Then he froze. Not at the stairs, not at the beacon housing above, at the ground, at the space beneath the tower platform where snow had drifted shallow against old concrete anchors. Ethan crouched. The beam of his flashlight moved across packed snow, weathered bolts, rot-dark beams, and then stopped on a faint discoloration near the base plate of the southern support. He leaned closer. Brown-red, not much. A smear no bigger than 2 fingers. Blood. Old enough to have darkened. New enough not to have completely broken down in the cold. Shadow gave a low, tight sound in his throat. Not aggression. "Alert." Ethan brought the radio up. "Maria, go. Sight isn't cold. I have blood under the platform." Silence for 1 beat too long. Then, "Human? Unknown. Anything else?" Ethan swept the light farther. There. Beneath a lip of drifted snow, almost invisible, unless you were kneeling, ran a shallow gouge in the crust. Parallel lines, repeated, like something heavy had been dragged and briefly caught. "Possible transport movement," Ethan said. "Recent enough Shadow's working it." "Lena's listening," Maria replied. "Stand by." Static shifted. Then Doctor. Lena Moore's voice came through, quieter than Maria's, but somehow more intent. "Cole, how fresh does the blood look?" "Hours, maybe less than a day." "Color?" "Dark, minimal freeze bloom." "Collect if you can. And Ethan, check for chemical odor. Ketamine, xylazine, tyaltamine, anything sharp, medicinal, or sweet under the wood rot." Ethan lowered his head toward the stain. At first he caught only the obvious: frozen earth, pine pitch, rust, old machine grease. Then something else. A flat chemical trace, faint but real. He stared at the mark a second longer. "Yeah," he said, "something's there." The cold seemed to deepen around him. A dead lookout, a live emergency beacon. Blood, sedative residue, not random, not kids trespassing, not some hunter taking shelter. He looked up at the black underside of the tower and felt the old internal shift happen, the one that tightened his thinking instead of his pulse. Information first, pattern second. Emotion later if it earned a place. "Shadow," he said quietly. The dog moved again, tracing the scent not upward but around the rear support where drifts pressed against rock. Ethan followed, flashlight searching. The hidden hatch was almost good enough to miss. Almost. It had been built flush against the base under a skirt of weathered boards and disguised with frozen debris. Whoever made it knew 2 things: how mountain structures aged and how little most people truly looked at what stood below eye level. Shadow planted in front of it, nostrils working, then snapped his head once toward Ethan. There it is. Ethan holstered the light, gloved fingers feeling along the board seam until he found the recessed pull cut. He keyed the radio once. "Concealed access point under the tower. Somebody used this place." "Wait for backup," Maria said immediately. Ethan studied the seam. No visible wire, no pressure trigger, no fresh scratch marks near the edge. But that meant very little in conditions like this. "Road won't hold long once the storm hits," he said. "If somebody staged here tonight, I need to know whether they left something live." Static. Then Maria, flatter now. "Proceed carefully, no heroics." Ethan almost smiled at that, though there was no humor in his face. Shadow shifted closer to his leg. Ethan rested one hand briefly against the dog's neck, feeling the heat under the thick fur. "Careful's the plan," he said. He pulled. The hatch opened with a crack of frozen seal and a spill of colder air from beneath the platform, air touched with metal, damp earth, and chemicals. Not empty. Used. Very recently. Ethan dropped to one knee and angled the light inside. A crawl space, deeper than expected. Reinforced in places. Old service access, maybe modified later. On the packed earth floor lay the print of a boot heel still sharply edged in the dusting of frost. Beside it, fibers snagged on a protruding bolt, black synthetic webbing. And farther in, half tucked against the beam shadow, something metallic glinted. Ethan reached in carefully, fingers closing around a spent syringe. He held it up. Even through gloves, he could feel the thinness of the barrel, the cheap precision of a tool bought for use, not regulation. Lena came on the radio again before he could speak. "What do you have?" "Syringe. Spent." "For animal transport or sedation?" "Likely." "Bag it. Don't contaminate the tip." He slid it into an evidence pouch from his vest and kept scanning. Shadow's breathing changed. The dog thrust his muzzle toward the deeper recess at the rear of the crawl space and gave a sharper alert this time, one paw lifting, then setting down with controlled impatience. Ethan angled the beam. At first it looked like a coil of cable. Then the light hit fur, just a few strands, short, dark, caught on a nailhead beside the rear wall. Canine. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Not much, but enough. Enough to say a dog had been here, enough to say this was no false alarm. He came back out from beneath the tower and stood slowly, letting the cold clear the confined chemical smell from his lungs. The red beacon above continued its hollow pulse into the dark, indifferent to everything below it. "Maria," he said, "this site was used to hold dogs." The ridge stayed silent for a second, except for the wind beginning to move in the trees lower down. Then Maria asked the question that mattered. "Working dogs?" Ethan looked at Shadow. Shadow was staring into the dark beyond the tower, body locked toward the forest slope behind the ridgeline. Not back at the road, not at the beacon. Away from the obvious. Toward the mountain. "That's what it's starting to look like," Ethan said. By first light, the ridge had turned the color of old steel. The horizon no longer glowed black-blue, but ash-gray, and a faint line of weather had started building over the western range like bruising beneath skin. Snow crusted Ethan's boots and the cuffs of his tactical pants. Shadow had not relaxed once. Neither had he. County forensics was too far out to make the ridge before weather closed the upper road, so they improvised the only way mountain counties ever really could, with skill, radio discipline, and people who knew how to think under pressure. Maria arrived first in a second unit just after dawn, stepping out into the cold with her parka unzipped, clipboard tucked under one arm, and that same unreadable calm she wore whether she was managing a budget hearing or a fatal scene. Captain Maria Hayes was not physically imposing in the obvious sense. She didn't need to be. She had the kind of presence that settled people into competence or exposed them if they didn't belong there. Mid-40s, compact, dark hair pulled tight under a knit cap, eyes that missed almost nothing. She crossed the site in quick, efficient strides and crouched beside the open hatch without comment. "Show me," she said. Ethan handed her the bagged syringe first. "Spent. Crawl space under the platform." Maria held it up to the weak light, then passed it carefully to Lena, who had arrived in the third vehicle with 2 hard cases and a portable field kit slung over one shoulder. Dr. Lena Moore moved with the inward focus of someone whose mind was already 3 levels deep into the evidence before anyone else had finished describing it. Tall, pale from too many indoor hours, dark curls escaping beneath a beanie, she set one case down in the snow and snapped on gloves. "For 2?" she asked. Ethan pointed. Lena crouched at the hatch, leaned in, and used forceps to retrieve the snagged hairs. She transferred them into a sterile sleeve, then opened the syringe bag just far enough to inspect the barrel markings without compromising more than necessary. Her eyes narrowed. "Not veterinary issue," she said. Maria looked at her. "Meaning?" "Aftermarket barrel. Cheap. Unregulated supply chain or farm black market bulk. Not something a licensed clinic would stock unless they wanted a hearing." She sniffed lightly at the open edge, then sealed it again. "And yeah," she added, "there's still residue." "Can you tell what?" Maria asked. "Field guess only." Lena's tone stayed careful. "Sedative mix, possibly transport grade. I'll know more when I test it." Ethan watched her scan the crawl space again. "What about the blood?" Lena crossed to the stain under the support, scraped a sample, and held the swab strip to the cold air for a second before capping it. "Canine," she said. Maria's head turned. "That fast?" "The smell and clotting pattern are enough to make the first call. I'll confirm later." No one said anything for a moment. The mountains spoke instead in small sounds, a shifting of frozen branches, a cable tapping somewhere in the tower frame, distant wind finding an opening along the ridge. Maria rose and turned slowly, surveying the site with new calculation. "If somebody used an abandoned county lookout as a holding point," she said, "then they either know our response gaps or they've tested them." "Probably both," Ethan said. Shadow moved then, not toward any of them, but around the rear of the tower again. Lucas Reed came jogging up from the vehicles at that exact moment, carrying a bolt cutter in one hand and a thermal monocular dangling from his neck. He was younger than the rest by more than a decade, all rangy speed and contained momentum, the sort of deputy who still moved like every call might become the story he'd tell 10 years later, except he was competent enough that the energy rarely got in his way. "Road's still holding," Lucas said, slightly short of breath. "But drifts are stacking lower switchback side. Another hour, maybe 2. Then he saw the expressions on their faces. "That bad?" Maria handed him nothing. She never needed to. Her tone alone set the level. "Worse if we're late," she said. "Thermal sweep the perimeter, wide first, then narrow on the backside drop." Lucas nodded once and moved. Lena had already set up a collapsible tray on the hood of her vehicle, laying out swabs, reagent strips, and a compact analyzer. Steam from her coffee cup curled beside the equipment and immediately vanished in the cold. Ethan stood with Maria facing the forest beyond the ridge. The timber fell away sharply there into a maze of old service cuts, avalanche chutes, and mining remnants nobody had fully mapped in years. "You thinking transport route?" Maria asked. "Yes." "Not road?" "Not only road." Ethan looked down toward the descending tree lines. "Too much concealment below, too many places to stage, move, disappear." Maria folded her arms against the cold. "And the beacon?" "Bait, or timing signal." "Or both," Lena said from the hood without looking up. They turned. She held up a reagent strip, now marked by a faint color shift. "Xylazine and ketamine traces at minimum. Sedation blend, like I said. Enough to keep an animal mobile, but compliant." "How many animals?" Maria asked. Lena gave a small, dissatisfied breath. No honest way to tell from this site alone. Then Lucas's voice cut across the ridge. "Got something." All 4 moved at once. He stood 50 yards downslope beyond the main tower line, where the land narrowed into a rock shelf before dropping into thick pine. At first Ethan saw nothing. Then Lucas stepped aside. Marker stones, not natural placement. 3 flat rocks stood upright in the snow at measured intervals, each turned on edge and partially buried. Nothing visible about them until Ethan crouched and brushed away the packed frost from the upper face of the first. A scratched line, arrowhead shape. On the second, 2 lines crossing. On the third, a dot inside a rough square. Trail code, not official, not hiking. Not ranch marking either. Shadow lunged forward just enough to confirm interest, then lowered his nose to the first marker and immediately pulled toward the descending tree line. Maria swore once, softly. Lena stared at the symbols. "These aren't random reassurance marks. Somebody expected to move in low visibility." Lucas looked between them. "Smugglers?" Ethan was already tracking where the line of stones disappeared through the timber. "Disciplined ones," he said. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch won't touch this in time." Maria nodded once. "Agreed." Then she looked at Ethan in the way commanders sometimes look at people they trust enough to give dangerous work to. "You take the track," she said. "Shadow leads. Lucas goes with you to the first stable access point only. No deeper, unless I approve it." Lucas opened his mouth, maybe to object to the limitation, maybe to volunteer more. Maria shut him down without changing expression. "You are not proving anything today, Reed. You are useful to me alive." A faint flush climbed Lucas's face. "Yes, ma'am." Maria turned to Lena. "You stay topside, sweep everything we've got, and pull all possible route logic from these markers." Lena was already photographing them. "On it!" Maria looked back at Ethan. "The weather's against you. If this line drops into anything unstable, you call it." Ethan said nothing for a second. Then, "If I call it, and they're inside still moving dogs, they vanish." Maria held his gaze. "And if I lose you and Shadow because you decide the mountain answers to your timetable, I don't get either of you back. Balance the equation." He nodded once. That was as close to agreement as either of them usually needed. Within 15 minutes they were moving downhill. The track was barely a track at all. The markers appeared only when Shadow led them to the correct angle, each one hidden just enough to disappear in flat light. The mountain swallowed sound fast under the new cold. Behind them, the ridge and tower faded from view until it felt as if the four vehicles, the radio mast, the county, and ordinary life itself had all been left in another world. Lucas followed in Ethan's steps where the slope narrowed, bolt cutter clipped to his pack, breath coming hard in white bursts. "What kind of people do this?" he asked after a while, voice kept low, more from instinct than necessity. Ethan didn't look back. "The kind that practice." Lucas was silent a moment. Then, "You really think they're moving stolen K9ES?" "I think they're moving something worth sedating, hiding, and cleaning up." That answer seemed to land harder than a more dramatic one might have. They continued. At first, the descent looked like ordinary mountain timber, but small details kept rearranging the story. A branch cut too cleanly to be storm damage. A snow crust broken and refrozen over an old boot impression. A length of nearly invisible monofilament tied ankle-high between two saplings at one bend of the trail. Ethan stopped a foot before walking into it. Lucas nearly collided with him from behind. "What?" Ethan pointed. Lucas stared. "Damn. Noise trap. Not lethal, just meant to pull a can line or snap a marker and tell anyone downslope that company was coming." Ethan crouched, traced the wire to a rusted ring hidden under snow, then clipped it silently with his field snips. "This route doesn't move amateurs," he said. Lucas exhaled through his nose. "Good to know." No, bad to know, Ethan thought, but he didn't say it. Another quarter-mile down, the timber broke over a cut in the mountain that looked natural until you stood above it. An old service trench, half collapsed, snowed over, reinforced decades earlier with rotting timber now barely visible through ice and brush. Near the center of the trench, set into stone and drift, a steel hatch rose at an angle beneath a frozen spill of rock. Lucas let out a low whistle. No way. Shadow planted at the hatch and looked back. There it was, the line's destination. Ethan knelt and brushed off the top edge. Under the snow, industrial steel, old county or mining issue, retrofitted with a new external hinge and a recently replaced padlock housing, except the padlock itself was gone. Maria's voice came over the radio, thinner now with terrain interference. "Cole, status." He keyed back. "Found an access hatch. Old underground route. Looks like mine service or avalanche maintenance." Static cracked. Then Lena's voice cut through. "That fits. The old silver cuts in that sector were partially linked to avalanche drainage tunnels in the 90s. Most were sealed on paper, not necessarily in reality." "Can you map it?" Ethan asked. "Trying. Half the records were digitized by idiots, and the other half by nobody." Lucas shifted beside him, studying the edges. "Fresh scrape marks," he said. "On the hinge." Ethan saw them too, used recently, repeatedly. Maria came back on. "You open that door, you do it knowing comms may die." Ethan rested one gloved hand on Shadow's shoulder. The dog was vibrating with focus now, nose fixed to the seam where air leaked through. The mountain exhaled cold from beneath the hatch. Not just cold, stale, chemical. "Occupied recently?" Ethan looked once at Lucas, once at the steel angle disappearing into the dark below, then pressed the transmit key. "We're going in." The hatch took both of them. Ethan wedged his boots into the snow and pulled on the recessed handle while Lucas braced from the side with one shoulder under the steel edge. For a second, nothing happened. Then the seal broke with a grinding shriek that echoed down into the dark below. A gust of air rolled up at them, cold enough to sting but carrying another scent beneath the mineral damp, oil, chemical residue, and something old that should have stayed buried. Shadow dropped his head instantly, nostrils flaring. "Easy," Ethan murmured. The hatch lifted far enough to reveal a narrow metal staircase vanishing at an angle into rock. Frost glazed the railings. Meltwater had frozen in translucent drips along the sidewall. Every sound they made came back thin and delayed, as if the mountain were listening before deciding whether to return it. Lucas clipped on his headlamp and looked down. "That is not comforting." "Then don't ask it for comfort," Ethan said. He keyed the radio. "Maria, opening access now, entering with Reed, Shadow active on lead." Static, then Maria's voice. "Copy. 2-minute check-ins until signal dies." Lena came in over her. Watch air quality if you can. Old tunnels trap exhaust and blasting residue. If you smell almonds, bleach, or burnt metal, that's not a suggestion. Lucas muttered, "Good morning to you too, Doc." That earned him no reply. Ethan drew a compact gas meter from a pouch, powered it on, waited for the boot cycle, then nodded once at the readout. Stable for now. He clipped it high on his vest where he could see it without taking his eyes off the tunnel. Then he descended. Shadow went first, light-footed despite his size, claws clicking softly on frozen steel. Ethan followed one step behind, left hand near the rail, right free. Lucas came after him, one hand on the hatch as though reluctant to let the surface world go. The staircase dropped farther than it should have, 20 feet, 30, 40. At the bottom, it opened into a concrete throat, reinforced with old steel ribs and patched at intervals with newer weld plates. The original tunnel had probably belonged to avalanche runoff control or mining overflow. Somebody had reclaimed it with practical intelligence and exactly zero concern for legality. Ethan swept his light. The floor had been graded. Not professionally, but repeatedly. Packed dirt and crushed gravel instead of raw stone or loam. The walls bore scrape marks at shoulder height, some fresh enough to still shine. Off to one side stood a stack of empty plastic transport crates collapsed flat for storage. Against the opposite wall, 3 metal hooks were bolted into a timber support beam. Shadow pulled toward the hooks, nose working hard. Ethan stepped closer. There, caught in the rust flake along one edge, were more short hairs, and beneath the beam lay a strip of frayed nylon webbing, the kind used in control leads or restraint loops. Lucas's face lost the last of its early morning loose energy. They really were keeping dogs down here? Not for long-term hold, Ethan said. How can you tell? No bedding, no feed bins, no waste buildup. Ethan scanned the floor. Transit point, temporary staging. The tunnel carried their voices away in flattened echoes. Lucas turned slowly, looking deeper into the dark run ahead. For where? Ethan didn't answer, because Shadow had already answered in the only way that mattered. The dog moved, not down the wide center line where footprints were easiest to read, but toward a narrow side recess half hidden by old caution mesh and a leaning panel of plywood. Ethan shoved the panel aside. Behind it, painted faintly on stone in fluorescent survey paint, was a symbol matching the marker at the ridge, a square with a dot in the center. Lucas swore under his breath. They mapped the whole thing. Ethan keyed the radio. Interior route confirmed. Fresh signs of canine transport. We've got symbols matching surface markers. Maria's reply arrived broken. How deep? Unknown. Keep your checks. The rest dissolved into static. Ethan listened to the empty hiss another second, then clipped the radio back. Comms are going. Lucas adjusted his lamp. That means she's definitely going to be thrilled with us. Then let's give her something worth being mad about. They moved deeper. The first 100 yards were almost straightforward. Too straightforward, which made Ethan distrust them on principle. The floor sloped gently, then split around a collapsed central section where the original tunnel had sheared inward years ago. One branch carried obvious traffic. The other looked abandoned but passable. Shadow took neither. He stopped dead between the two paths and swung his head toward the wall itself. Ethan stepped closer and found a vent seam no wider than a palm, concealed by dark mineral staining. Cold air leaked through it in a thin current. "Service cut," he said. Lucas crouched beside him. "You're kidding." A half-minute with the bolt cutter and a pry bar from Lucas's pack exposed a maintenance door built into the wall behind the seam. New hinges, old frame. False choices, Ethan thought. The main paths were for whoever didn't bring a dog. He opened the maintenance door and angled his light inside. Narrower passage, lower ceiling, less traveled, but not unused. Shadow slipped through without hesitation. The air changed at once, more stagnant, more chemical, a faint, bitter odor layered under wet stone. Ethan checked the gas meter. Oxygen slightly down, nothing critical yet. The maintenance passage twisted sharply, opening after 50 yards into a junction chamber where the ceiling rose high enough to lose the beam. Here, the hidden nature of the route ended. The place had been worked. Portable generator marks blackened one corner of the floor. Empty cable spools lay stacked against the wall. A folding table stood collapsed beside a crate of spent batteries. Someone had operated from this chamber repeatedly, probably during weather events when aerial visibility was poor and road patrols were lazy or overcommitted. Lena's earlier phrase came back to him. Not a random stop. A disciplined route. Shadow crossed the chamber in a straight line to the far wall and stopped beside a cluster of hanging metal strips wired together with fishing line and washers. Lucas saw it too. Noise curtain. Yeah, meant to announce intrusion. Maybe also to panic animals. Maybe just one more layer between them and anyone getting close. Ethan used the knife from his vest to hold the strip still while Lucas clipped the line anchor. Something clattered anyway, small but sharp. The sound shot down the tunnel beyond like a thrown pebble in a cathedral. Then silence. Lucas winced. Tell me that didn't matter. Ethan was already listening. Far off, too far to locate cleanly, came a metallic knock. Not rockfall, not water. Mechanical, one knock, then another. He looked at Lucas. Move. They advanced faster now, lights cutting narrow tunnels through the black. Shadow lengthened his stride, lead pulling tight but controlled, whole body streamlined into purpose. The passage bent left, then dipped under a lattice of ancient support beams where ice crystals hung like needles. Twice Ethan spotted old dead-end branches veiled with paint symbols that had been altered just enough to mislead anyone reading fast. Each correction Shadow made sharpened his trust in the dog beyond the technology strapped to his own vest. A minute later, they reached the first real danger. The corridor widened unexpectedly into a chamber lined with suspended lengths of rebar and cable, strung at chest and knee height in a crisscross pattern. Some pieces carried small clipped metal tabs. Others ended in old cans half full of bolts. Lucas stopped short. Jesus. Trap field not to kill, to expose, to create noise, confusion, injury, and delay in darkness. Ethan swept his light carefully and saw the solution almost at once. A narrow path had been left through it, visible only from one angle where scuff marks on the floor aligned. Stay exactly in my steps, he said. Shadow already had the path, weaving with impossible precision through the hanging grid. Ethan followed, ducking one cable, stepping over another, sliding sideways past a dangling brace that would have detonated the entire chamber into metal chaos if brushed. Lucas came behind him, breathing through his teeth. Halfway through, one of his shoulders grazed a line. A can rattled once, then steadied. All three froze. Somewhere ahead, that same mechanical knock returned, faster this time, then stopped. Ethan didn't wait to interpret it. He got them out of the chamber and into the next corridor just as the air pressure subtly changed, a soft inward pull as if the tunnel had taken a breath. He checked the gas meter again. No gas spike, but the mountain was changing around them. Think they know we're here? Lucas whispered. Ethan gave him a look in the dim light. That's what the traps are for. The corridor narrowed sharply after that and became wetter. Ice gave way to dark runoff in grooves along the rock. More recent boot prints appeared in the mud, some overlaid, some fresh enough to still hold crisp heel tread. Ethan counted at least 3 individuals, maybe 4. Hard to tell in the mess of repeated passage. Then Shadow stopped so hard the lead jolted Ethan's wrist. The dog's head lifted, ears cutting forward. A sound floated through the dark ahead. Not machinery this time, a whine, brief, hoarse, alive. Lucas heard it too. Dog? Ethan listened. Another whine, followed by the scrape of movement against metal. Everything in him tightened and settled at once. Go, he said. They rounded the next bend and found a side-holding alcove built into the rock behind a chain barrier. 2 transport cages sat against the wall, one empty, one occupied. The Malinois inside was standing, barely. Young adult, underweight, muzzle abrasion, sedation patch shaved into the foreleg, eyes bright with fear and overstimulation. The dog hit the cage door once when the light struck, then recoiled, nails scrambling against the floor. Easy, Ethan said immediately. Shadow's posture changed too. Not prey, not challenge, but high alert, threaded with something close to recognition. Working dog to working dog, same class of nerve, same underlying wiring. Lucas knelt beside the cage. Can we get him out? Ethan scanned the alcove first. No visible cameras, no pressure plate. A simple barrel latch reinforced with zip ties. He doesn't help us if he's locked in when this place goes bad, Ethan said. Lucas cut the ties. The Malinois didn't bolt when the door opened. He stood shaking, uncertain, eyes bouncing between Ethan, Shadow, and the open passage, as if freedom itself had become suspicious. Ethan crouched sideways to reduce his profile. Come on! The dog hesitated. Shadow took one step forward, slow and balanced, then stopped. That did it. The Malinois crept out, head low, then pressed instinctively toward Shadow's flank, seeking structure from the one thing here that made immediate sense. Lucas exhaled. Well, that's something. Something dangerous, too, Ethan thought. Another living body to protect, another variable. But leaving him wasn't an option. He clipped an emergency line from his belt to the loose ring on the dog's collar. Homemade collar, no tags. "Stay with me," Ethan said. He keyed the radio again, though he knew it was a gamble. "Maria, we've recovered one live canine. Repeat, one live canine, likely stolen. Continuing interior." Only static answered. Then, faint and broken, Lena's voice. "Beacon, not distress. Diversion pattern. If you find charges, assume linked—" The rest died in hiss. Ethan stared at the radio for half a second. Diversion pattern, charges, that mechanical knocking ahead. Detonator test, relay timing, or someone manually clearing the route. Lucas must have drawn the same conclusion because his face went pale under the headlamp glow. "We need to know what they're trying to bury." Ethan nodded once. "Yeah." They pressed on. The tunnel now bore the unmistakable signs of active demolition prep. Fresh drilling dust collected in pale crescents at the base of selected supports. Narrow wires disappeared into cracks packed with new mortar. On the floor near one rib brace lay the torn corner of a blasting cap box. Lucas crouched over it. This isn't old mining junk. No, they're bringing the whole thing down. Only the parts they need to erase. Shadow surged again, this time dragging both dogs toward a sharp right cut. Ethan followed and nearly walked into a door-sized slab of reinforced steel dropped vertically into guide rails. Blast section. It sat open by barely 2 feet, enough for air and a person to squeeze through sideways. Lucas stepped forward. This wasn't in any county records I've ever seen. Because it's not county. Ethan checked the guide assembly. Hydraulic assist removed long ago. Manual override wheel on one side, recently greased, and on the wall beside it, another painted symbol, crossed lines. Lucas pointed. "Second marker from the ridge." "This is the interior checkpoint," Ethan said. He swept the beam through the gap. Beyond it, the tunnel widened into a larger chamber, but his light caught only fragments, old trackbed, stacked crates, hanging cables. Then, from somewhere farther in, came a human voice, muffled, distorted by rock and distance, but unmistakably human. Lucas straightened. "Did you hear that?" Ethan did. Then came another sound, a sharp metallic slam from deeper still, and Lucas's radio burst to life with a storm of static so violent it made both dogs flinch. After the static, a single fragment cut through. "Lucas!" Maria. Then silence. Lucas grabbed his radio. "Captain? Captain, say again!" Nothing. He looked at Ethan. For the first time since entering the hatch, he looked less like a deputy on a mission and more like the young man he still partly was. "That was me, right? She said my name?" Ethan held his gaze. "Yeah." They squeezed through the blast gap one at a time. Shadow first, then the rescued Malinois urged after him, then Ethan, then Lucas. The air beyond was worse, hotter in patches from hidden equipment fouled with diesel and explosive dust. The gas meter ticked a warning, not red yet, but climbing. The chamber on the far side told the rest of the story. Rail carts, portable heaters, a bank of dead monitors, plastic-wrapped crates sized for weapons or animal transport, an improvised veterinary table under a hanging work lamp. And near the far wall, an open control box wired to a bundle of charge lines, disappearing into 3 separate tunnel branches. Lucas stared at it. No way. There were no smugglers here now. No handlers, no shooters waiting in the shadows, only the remnants of rapid abandonment. They had already moved their last load, and now they meant to wipe the route. Ethan crossed to the control box, studied the improvised timer, the battery bank, the relay switch array. Not military grade, not professional demolitions in the formal sense, but assembled by someone who understood enough to kill the evidence and anyone delayed inside it. "How long?" Lucas asked. Ethan didn't answer until he found the digital timer module clipped behind the relay panel. 3 hours, 12 minutes. Not much, but enough if the route stayed stable. Then Shadow turned sharply toward the far left branch of the chamber and barked once. Not alarm. Locate. Lucas looked that way too. "What is it?" Ethan was already moving when a crack split through the dark ahead like a rifle shot. Rock dust burst from the ceiling of the left branch. A second later came the deeper, uglier sound of structural failure, a groan rolling through the stone, low enough to feel through the soles of his boots. And then, faint beneath it, "Cole!" Lucas froze. "That's not—" No, not him, his own voice, somewhere ahead. Then Ethan understood. Not Cole. Help. No. A third listen gave it shape. "Reed!" Lucas went white. "Deputy Lucas Reed," Ethan said sharply, grabbing his shoulder before he could bolt. "You stay with me and you think." Lucas forced air in through his nose. "Someone's ahead." "Yeah." Another crack sounded from the left branch, then a shower of pebbles. Whoever was beyond that section was about to lose the tunnel. Ethan looked from the unstable branch to the control box to the timer and made the equation the only way it could be made. Save the trap person, stop the demolition, get both dogs and Lucas out alive. Impossible on paper, necessary in reality. He clipped the emergency line from the rescued Malinois to an anchor ring on his belt and looked down at Shadow. "Find him!" Shadow launched into the dark. Shadow disappeared into the left branch so fast that his paws barely seemed to touch the ground. Ethan followed at a controlled run, light bouncing over wet rock and fractured support braces, while Lucas stayed on his shoulder with the rescued Malinois straining behind them. The left branch narrowed almost immediately, forcing them single file. The air grew thicker, laced now with pulverized concrete and that metallic aftertaste that sat on the back of the tongue when the earth had started breaking itself apart. Another tremor rolled through the tunnel, not a full collapse, a warning. Dust spilled in gray veils from the seams overhead. The beam of Ethan's flashlight caught the particles and turned the air into a moving wall of glittering grit. "Shadow," he called. A bark came back farther ahead, then 2 quick barks. "Locate confirmed." They rounded a bend and entered what had once been a service junction, now half ruined by age and half repurposed by recent use. One passage had already pancaked inward beneath a sheared support beam. Another remained open by a crawl space of twisted steel and broken stone. Beyond it, through the narrow angle of debris, Ethan saw movement. A man in county winter gear, pinned at the waist beneath a collapsed lattice of conduit and fractured timber. Deputy Lucas Reed, not the one beside him, the one beyond the debris. For one impossible second, the image made no sense at all. Then Ethan saw the shoulder patch more clearly through the dust. Not Lucas. Someone wearing a county jacket, a decoy, a stolen coat, or somebody from another shift Ethan hadn't been told about. The trapped man turned his head weakly into the light, face streaked gray with dirt and blood. Mid-30s, not one of theirs. Unknown. He coughed hard and shouted again, voice breaking. "Please," Lucas swore, "that's not county issue from our department." "No," Ethan said, "but it got our attention." Shadow had already crawled halfway through the debris gap and was standing just beyond the pinned man, barking into the darkness farther behind him. Not at the man, past him. Ethan's mind moved the pieces together. The stolen jacket had been bait, left where a voice and a patch would pull response deeper. But Shadow wasn't fixated on the visible casualty. He was alerting beyond him. "Stay on the line," Ethan said. Lucas blinked. "What?" Ethan pointed his light past the trapped man through a ragged opening in the broken support web. Another boot, then a hand, and then the shape of a second body lying beyond the first, half obscured by fallen mesh and dust. County radio clipped to the shoulder harness. Lucas's own backup winter shell, identical to the one he was wearing now because the department bought in bulk. No wonder the first glance had confused the scene. This time the face was familiar. Deputy Lucas Reed's breath stopped audibly behind Ethan. The real Lucas lay 20 feet beyond the decoy jacket, down in the shattered continuation of the passage, separated by a crush of debris and hanging conduit. His headlamp was broken, one leg pinned, motionless except for a faint twitch of one hand. For a half second, neither Ethan nor Lucas moved. Then Lucas found his voice in a hoarse whisper. "How is that possible?" Ethan understood almost at once because the answer was ugly and simple. The smugglers had taken county cold weather gear from a prior theft or ambush. The fake casualty near the front had been placed to drag responders into the unstable choke point, and Lucas, earlier in the week, maybe on a separate search or maintenance check, had gotten caught inside, isolated, written off by the people who left him there while they prepared the final cleanup. But this Lucas was alive, and the Lucas standing behind Ethan wasn't possible. Then reality corrected itself in the next beat. Not Lucas behind him. Deputy Lucas Reed beside Ethan, alive and breathing, stared into the dust with all the blood draining from his face. The man pinned deeper in the collapse was not Lucas. It was a smuggler wearing stolen county gear and a beanie pulled low. And beyond him, still farther in, barely visible now as Shadow barked again, was the actual source of the scent trail. Not a person. A dog. Ethan's flashlight finally found the crate. Steel door bent inward. Vent slits clogged with dust. The crate rocked once from movement inside. That was what Shadow had been calling. A second live K9. The pinned man near the front coughed violently. Blood touched his lips. Not enough time to untangle everything morally. There was only time to decide priorities. Lucas swallowed hard. "What do we do?" The chamber answered for him with a deep internal groan, followed by the sharp crack of another beam shearing overhead. Ethan made the decision instantly. "We take the live dog and the man if we can move him. Fast." Lucas nodded once. The shock in his face burned off into focus. They dropped to work. The first casualty, smuggler or not, was trapped beneath a triangle of conduit and timber that pinned his hips but left his chest free. He was conscious enough to panic, which complicated everything. "Don't pull me," the man gasped. Don't. "I need you breathing, not talking," Ethan said. The man's eyes darted to Shadow, to the dark beyond, to the shifting rock above. "They left us," he whispered. That Ethan believed. Lucas slid in beside Ethan, bracing one shoulder under a beam while Ethan tested the load. Too heavy to shift cleanly by hand, but not immovable if levered. "Use the pry bar," Ethan said. Lucas passed it forward. Ethan found purchase under the edge of the timber and drove upward with controlled force while Lucas dragged broken conduit free, one length at a time. The tunnel shuddered again. Dust poured down the back of Ethan's neck. Shadow barked once, harsh and urgent, from the far side of the gap. "I know," Ethan muttered. They got the beam up 2 inches, then 3. "Move!" Ethan snapped. The pinned man clawed at the stone and managed to slide just enough for Lucas to yank him clear by the jacket. The man screamed once, then collapsed half on top of Lucas, clutching his leg. "Can he walk?" Lucas asked. "No." "Great." The crate beyond rocked again, harder. The animal inside was panicking now. Ethan shoved through the debris gap, shoulders scraping steel, and landed in the secondary pocket where the crate had jammed against fallen mesh. Shadow was there already, standing guard, body angled protectively toward the crate while keeping one eye on the cracking ceiling. The label on the crate had been ripped off. A slit of amber eye flashed through the vent. Shepherd. Sedated recently, maybe not fully recovered. Frantic but alive. Ethan knelt and found the latch bent from impact. He had to wrench it twice before it gave. The door sprang outward. The dog burst halfway out, hit the lead of the crate frame, and almost fell. She was too weak to stand properly, rear legs slipping under her. "Easy," Ethan said, dropping to one knee. Shadow moved close but calm, not crowding. The shepherd's nostrils flared. She smelled Ethan. She smelled Shadow. She smelled open air and collapse and fear, and maybe, under all of it, the one thing that could still organize the world, another working dog who was steady. She crawled the rest of the way out. Ethan clipped a spare line through the collar ring and handed it back through the gap to Lucas. "Take her." Lucas grabbed the lead one-handed while keeping the injured man from rolling back into the choke point with the other. "I'm out of hands here." "Then grow more." Despite everything, Lucas gave a single breath that might have been a laugh. Then the tunnel boomed. Not an explosion. A full section somewhere deeper giving way. The pressure wave hit them like a slap, followed by a roar of rock rushing through unseen space. Ethan's gas meter chirped. Oxygen falling, particulate spiking. And then his radio screamed with sudden life. "Cole!" Maria's voice, loud for one miraculous second. "Lena found the master branch map. Left spur feeds a demolition spine. You've got one primary charge at the vent sump and one relay at the blast section. If the blast door seals, the whole interior becomes a coffin. Do you copy?" Ethan snatched the radio. "Copy. We have 2 live dogs and 1 injured male. Unknown affiliation." Lena's voice came over Maria's shoulder, fast and analytical. "The relay node should be in the central chamber box you saw, but if the timer is linked to pressure or line continuity, Cutting random wires could accelerate the sequence. "Do you have a shutoff?" "Not from here," Maria came back. "Then your priority is extraction." Ethan looked at the dust-choked gap, the injured man, Lucas trying to manage three impossible things at once. Shadow poised in the dark like a held arrow, and the new shepherd trembling at the edge of collapse. Then he looked deeper into the spur where the roar had come from. If the primary charge at the vent sump blew, the venting path would reverse. Toxic air, dust, and collapse pressure would rip back through this whole interior, including the route to the hatch. Extraction alone might no longer be enough. "Negative," Ethan said. Maria's silence told him exactly how much she hated that answer. "Say again." "If the primary goes, nobody gets out through this line." Lucas's eyes snapped to him. "Ethan," Maria's voice went cold, "you do not get to improvise martyrdom for my department." "I'm improvising survival," Ethan said. "Need route logic, fast." There was breathing on the line. Wind. Keyboard taps maybe from Lena at the vehicles above. Then Lena spoke. "The vent sump should sit below the old drainage spine. If the smugglers repurposed it, it'll be the lowest technical point in the network. Water outflow, air exchange, maybe generator exhaust. Follow the runoff." Ethan flashed his light down the deeper spur. Water glimmered along the floor in a black channel. "That way." Maria came back before he could answer. "Cole, if you commit deeper, Reed extracts the casualty and both dogs now. That's the order." Ethan looked at Lucas. Lucas looked back, jaw tight, eyes saying three different things at once. Loyalty, fear, refusal? Ethan made it simple for him. "You're taking them out." Lucas opened his mouth. Ethan cut him off. "That's not debate. You know the route. You've got the most to carry. I need speed, not company." Lucas's face hardened with the hurt of being left and the discipline to obey anyway. "Yes, sir." Ethan grabbed his shoulder once, hard enough to anchor it. "Get them to Maria. Tell Lena I need full relay logic on the move." Then he turned to the injured man. "Can you crawl?" The man nodded weakly. "Good, because nobody here is carrying you." Lucas got an arm under the man's shoulder and hauled him toward the gap. The rescued shepherd stumbled after the lead. The Malinois pressed close to Shadow for one final second, then reluctantly followed Lucas when Ethan shoved him gently in that direction. Now the choice was real. Out with them, or deeper with Shadow. The mountain answered by dropping another scatter of rock from the ceiling. Ethan moved. He and Shadow drove down the runoff path at a run, boots splashing into cold black water that laced over stone and disappeared through grates cut into the floor. The passage beyond the collapse pocket narrowed, then broadened into what must once have been an engineered drainage artery for melt and avalanche pressure. Someone had retrofitted sections with cable trays and temporary lighting, though most fixtures now hung dead or broken. Only Ethan's flashlight and Lucas's receding beam behind him broke the dark. "Shadow?" The dog surged ahead. No leash now, only voice and bond. The gas meter chirped again. Oxygen down another point. Carbon monoxide trace rising. Not enough to drop him yet. Enough to shorten the clock. He keyed the radio while moving. "Lena." Static. Then, "Go." "Need guidance to the vent sump." "We think the runoff spine intersects a vertical shaft below the central chamber. Look for a fan housing or improvised exhaust shroud. The primary charge will either be mounted to the shaft collar or to the support ring carrying the sump chamber." "Can I stop it?" A pause. Then, honestly, "Maybe." Not comforting. Useful. Ahead, Shadow barked sharply and vanished around a bend. Ethan reached the corner and nearly slipped. The floor dropped into a grated pit where black water churned under a rusted catwalk. Beyond it rose a cylindrical chamber cut down through the rock, maybe 30 feet across, maybe more. At its center stood an old vent column reinforced with newer steel braces. Cable bundles ran up the side of it like veins. Mounted at the base was a box the size of a field generator, wired to shaped charges set around the collar ring. Primary node. Lena had been right. Ethan swung his light up. A fan assembly above the column had seized long ago. Ice rimed the blades. Below it, fresh welds and bolted brackets told the rest of the story. They had turned a dead ventilation shaft into a demolition chimney. Shadow circled the base once and stopped at the control casing, nose fixed on something Ethan hadn't yet seen. Then a red diode blinked in the dark. Active. Timer running locally, too. Ethan crouched beside it, peeled back the improvised metal cover, and felt his stomach go colder than the mountain. The wiring was layered, deliberately messy. Real circuits hidden inside fake ones. A continuity loop running to secondary branches. Pressure trigger failsafe. Battery backup. Someone had built this to punish guesswork. He took one slow breath. Not military, not clean, but not random either. He could disarm explosive systems under ideal conditions. Years ago, under other uniforms in hotter countries with better light and younger hands. He could at least read the logic now. But the tunnel was failing around him. The air was degrading, and whatever manuals he once knew did not account for water dripping into exposed relays in a mountain built by different generations of bad decisions. "Lena," he said into the radio, "you still there?" Her reply came faint, fading in and out. "Barely." "I've got the primary. It's nested. False leads, continuity loop, backup battery. Need to know whether cutting the timer module alone breaks or closes the circuit." "I can't tell without seeing the relay layout." He swung the radio camera feed from his shoulder light toward the open casing. Grainy, shaky, but maybe enough. Static ate half the image. Then Lena said, "Hold it steady." He did. Shadow stood at his back facing the tunnel they'd come through, ears forward, guarding the only approach, while Ethan held the light and the camera on the maze of wires. 10 seconds. 20. The chamber seemed to shrink with every breath. Then Lena spoke, fast now, seeing it. "The blue wire cluster is fake. Ignore all blue. The outer red pair is also decoy. Real trigger should be in the inner shielded bundle. Wait. Yes. There's a pressure relay hidden behind the battery mount. If you cut power before isolating the pressure relay, it closes the line." Meaning boom. Meaning definitely boom. Ethan set his jaw. "How do I isolate it?" "Remove the battery bracket without jarring the plate." He stared at the rusted screws, the water beating down the side of the box, the shaky bracket welded in one corner and bolted in another. "You do hear yourself, right?" For the first time all night, Lena sounded almost humanly strained. "I'm aware." The radio crackled again, and Maria cut in. "Cole, reads on the way out with both dogs and the casualty. Hatch ETA 9 minutes if the route holds." "Good. One thing moving the right direction." Then Maria added, voice quieter now, "You've got about the same before outer wind shear collapses the ridge road." Meaning, even if he survived the disarm, surface extraction was about to become its own war. "Copy," Ethan said. He set the radio down beside the casing. Shadow looked back once. Ethan met his eyes. "Stay." The dog did not move. Ethan reached into the guts of the primary charge system with both gloved hands, fingertips searching for the hidden bracket behind the battery mount, while the mountain groaned around him like something waking in pain. The first screw refused to move. Ethan felt it through the driver bit before he saw it. The gritty resistance of corroded metal fused to a bracket that had no business carrying this much weight and consequence. Water dripped from somewhere overhead in cold, patient taps. Each drop sounded louder than it should have in the shaft chamber. He adjusted his grip and tried again. Nothing. Behind him, Shadow's stance changed. Not a bark, not yet. Just a sharpened stillness that ran like current through the dog's frame. Ethan spoke without turning. "What is it?" Shadow gave one low rumble toward the tunnel. Movement. Not rockfall this time, not the mountain shifting. Something measured, human or human-made. Ethan looked once at the timer inside the box. 8 minutes, 42 seconds. He forced his breathing flatter, shorter. Panic made hands clumsy. Clumsy hands killed people. He withdrew the driver, switched to a narrower bit, and wedged it beneath the edge of the battery bracket instead of the screw itself. If he couldn't loosen the fastener cleanly, maybe he could create lift without tripping the pressure relay hidden behind it. The metal complained. Bent a fraction, stopped. "Lena," he said into the radio without taking his eyes off the casing, "if I pry the bracket instead of removing the screw, how much travel trips the relay?" Static. Then her voice, thin and urgent. "Unknown, millimeters, maybe less. I need the angle." He shifted the light. The beam shook once across the wiring. "Like that?" "Lower? Hold." He held. Seconds dragged. The timer slipped to 8:17. Then Lena inhaled sharply over the radio. "Wait, there's a secondary tab at the lower right corner. Not visible unless, yes, it's not welded, it's pinned." Ethan found it by touch. a stub of metal no thicker than a nail threaded through the bracket's lower arm. "Remove that first," Lena said. "If the lower pin holds tension, prying the top could transfer pressure straight into the relay." "How much confidence do you have in that?" "Less than I'd like, more than the other option." "Good enough." He set the driver aside and took out a multi-tool, working the pliers into the narrow gap. His gloves were suddenly too thick, too stupid. He pulled one off with his teeth and shoved his bare right hand back into the wet cold of the open box. Instant pain, he ignored it. Fingertips found the pin, slick with condensation, almost impossible to grip. Behind him, Shadow gave a short, hard bark. "Closer now." Ethan didn't turn. "Shadow, hold." The dog obeyed, but Ethan heard claws shift on the grated catwalk, heard breath leave his chest in a sharp burst, heard him settle into a guarding posture one step nearer the tunnel mouth. Not fear. Readiness. The pin moved. A fraction. Then again. Ethan pulled it free and set it carefully on the casing lid as if it were somehow more dangerous to drop than the explosives surrounding it. "Timer, 7:39. "All right," Lena said. "Now, top bracket. Slow. If the relay plate moves, stop." "That the technical language?" "That's the best I've got." He almost smiled. Almost. Instead, he slid the multi-tool under the upper edge and applied pressure so gradually it felt like trying to bend the mountain with two fingers. The bracket lifted. A millimeter, two. Under it, in the cramped cavity, he finally saw the hidden plate Lena had described, a spring-loaded pressure switch seated against the battery housing. The bracket had been keeping tension on it. Release the wrong way, and the switch would close. Ethan held the bracket where it was and reached with his bare fingers for the battery mount itself. Too tight. No clearance. He needed something to hold the bracket off the switch while he pulled the battery free, something thin, rigid, precise. His eyes went to the pin. He took it, slid it sideways into the gap he had just created, and used it like a shim between bracket and plate. The timer dropped to 7:01. Nothing detonated. "Lena?" "I see it. Good. Keep the shim stable and pull the battery straight back, not up." He got two fingers on the battery tab and tugged. It stuck. He pulled harder. Still nothing. "Come on," he whispered. The battery came free so suddenly that he nearly lost the shim. He froze, every muscle locked. No flash, no blast. The timer display died, but not the red diode, backup power. Of course. Lena swore softly over the radio, the sound stripped of all her usual reserve. "There's a secondary cell on the relay board." "Where?" "Left side, behind the false bundle. You'll have to clear the decoys." That meant touching more wires. Water dripped onto Ethan's wrist and ran down into the sleeve of his jacket. The cold reached bone. Shadow barked again, this time full volume. A voice shouted from the tunnel. Not Maria, not Lucas. Male, rough, close. And then a gunshot cracked through the shaft corridor. The round punched sparks off steel somewhere above Ethan's head. He turned. A figure had appeared at the mouth of the chamber, half obscured by dust and backscatter from a flashlight beam. Thick jacket, ball cap, pistol in hand, one leg dragging slightly like he had come through bad terrain in a hurry. He must have returned by some alternate route or hidden deeper in the network when the others pulled out. Shadow launched before the man fired a second time. The shepherd covered the catwalk distance in a black and tan blur, hit the shooter high at the chest, and drove him sideways into the rail with a metallic crash. The pistol went spinning across the grate and vanished into the runoff below. The man screamed. Ethan had seen plenty of violence in his life, enough that he no longer romanticized speed. But Shadow at full committed force was something elemental, not rage, not chaos, but precision released. The dog did not maul wildly. He controlled, drove, neutralized. Still, Ethan had no time to help him. The red diode kept blinking. Backup power kept the primary alive. He turned back to the board, shoved aside the fake blue bundle Lena had warned him about, and found the secondary cell nested in shrink wrap behind a useless row of decoy connectors. No bracket this time, just taped retention. He ripped it loose and disconnected it clean. The red diode died. For half a second, Ethan did not trust the darkness. "Lena?" Silence. Then her voice came through weakly. "Primary just dropped from our read. I think you killed it." Think. Not the word he wanted, the only word available. Behind him, the struggle on the catwalk had changed pitch. Not active fighting now. Heavy breath. A body hitting metal. Shadow's warning growl vibrating through the chamber. Ethan spun. The man was down on his side against the railing, hands over his face, too stunned and terrified to do anything except curl. Shadow stood over him, front paws braced, teeth bared inches from the man's throat, every line of his body saying one thing with absolute clarity: move wrong, and this ends differently. Ethan crossed the chamber, drew flex cuffs from his vest, and kicked the man flat. "Hands!" The man obeyed instantly. Ethan cuffed him, checked for another weapon, found a folding knife and a second pistol mag, then dragged him clear of Shadow's line. The shooter looked up at him with wild, dust-caked eyes. "You don't know what this place is." "No," Ethan said, "but I know what you tried to turn it into." He stood and clipped Shadow back to verbal control alone. "Off." Shadow stepped away at once, chest heaving, gaze still locked on the prisoner. The timer was dead, the primary charge silent. But the tunnel kept talking. A new series of deep concussions rolled somewhere beyond the shaft, not close enough to be the main demolition sequence, but close enough to say other sections were already failing independently. The network had been weakened too long, too hard. Even if the charges were dead, the mountain had momentum now. Ethan keyed the radio. "Maria, primary is down. Repeat, primary disabled. One armed suspect in custody. Tunnel remains unstable." Maria's reply came fast, sharper than before. "Reed made surface. Both recovered dogs alive. Casualty alive. Ridge Road is degrading. You need to move now." Good. Lucas had done it. For the first time all night, one part of the equation felt solid. Understood. He hauled the prisoner up by the jacket, shoved him ahead onto the catwalk, and started back toward the main corridor with Shadow covering the rear flank. The return route was worse. Without the singular focus of the bomb in front of him, Ethan could now feel what the mountain was doing all around them. Air moved in erratic pulses through the corridor as blocked channels opened and others choked shut. Dust thickened, turning the flashlight beam opaque. Twice he had to stop the prisoner from falling through broken grate where runoff had eaten away the support beneath. At the first bend, the gas meter chirped a red line warning and then died entirely, clogged with particulate or simply overwhelmed. From here on, instinct and Shadow. They reached the collapsed pocket where he had separated from Lucas. It had narrowed further. The gap between the broken conduit and stone was now barely shoulder width. Rock still ticked down from above in tiny impacts. The prisoner balked. "I can't fit." "You can if you want air." The man stared into the gap, then at Shadow behind him, and made the correct choice. He turned sideways and shoved through, scraping cloth, skin, and ego off both sides. Ethan followed. For a moment halfway through, debris shifted and locked against his plate carrier. Stone ground across his back. The tunnel squeezed down until he could feel his own pulse pounding in his throat. Not enough room, not enough air, too much weight. Then, Shadow, already through, barked once from the far side. Ethan exhaled, flattened another inch, and drove through the snag point on raw force. He came out coughing into the wider passage beyond. No time to recover. He pushed on. The noise curtain chamber was next. Half the suspended rebar was already tangled on the ground from vibration, turning the carefully laid trap into a jagged maze of metal teeth. The original safe path no longer existed. Ethan shoved the prisoner ahead with one hand and used the flashlight to clear the worst snags with his boot, while Shadow threaded impossibly through openings that should have been too small. One hanging strip caught Ethan across the cheek and ripped a hot line of pain beneath his eye. He ignored it. The maintenance passage beyond was blacker than before, the air more dead. Somewhere behind them, the shaft chamber thundered once. Not a detonation, but a collapse swallowing the space he had just left. If he had stayed another 30 seconds. He did not finish the thought. At the hidden service door, the hinges had bent inward from tunnel shift. The door would not open fully. The prisoner started babbling then, saying something about not wanting to die, not wanting to be buried, not being the one who set the charges. Ethan grabbed the front of his jacket and slammed him once against the frame, not hard enough to injure, just enough to reset his mind. Pull! Between the two of them, with Shadow pressing through the opening the instant it widened, they forced the door enough to squeeze into the false corridor that led back toward the original split. There, the air improved slightly. Surface direction. Ethan keyed the radio again. "Maria, status on hatch team?" Her answer came choppy but readable. "I'm at the hatch. Lena with me. Reed's conscious. Casualty loaded. We hear intermittent movement below. If you're close, make noise." Ethan looked at the prisoner. "You heard her." The man took one breath and shouted. Not enough. Ethan shoved him forward. "Louder!" The man yelled again, voice cracking against the stone. Then the tunnel answered from ahead with a faint metallic bang. From the hatch. They were close. Shadow surged past both of them, hit the final incline at a sprint, and vanished upward. Ethan could hear claws on steel stairs, hear Maria shouting something above, hear Lucas's voice too, rough and exhausted, but alive. When Ethan and the prisoner reached the base of the staircase, cold daylight was spilling down from above in a slanted blade of white. The hatch stood open. Maria was there at the top with a rifle slung and one gloved hand extended. Lena beside her. Lucas on one knee farther back in the snow, one arm around the recovered shepherd, while the Malinois leaned against his leg, both dogs dusted gray from the tunnel. The injured casualty lay strapped onto a rescue sled near the vehicles. And Shadow. Shadow stood at the hatch edge, snow collecting on his back, staring down the staircase until Ethan came into full view. Only then did the dog step aside. Ethan climbed the last 10 feet, feeling twice his age and 10 times his weight. The cold air hit his face like surf. He grabbed Maria's forearm and let her haul him through the opening into the stormlight, just as the ground beneath the hatch gave a deep, rolling shudder. "Move!" Maria snapped. They dragged the prisoner clear. Lena and Lucas slammed the hatch shut by instinct more than logic, and all 6 of them stumbled backward through blowing snow as the surface around the access point dropped 2 inches in a circle and held, then settled. No eruption, no chimney blast, no full blowout. The mountain had accepted the disruption without spitting it back at them. For now. Maria bent over, hands on her knees, breathing hard. Then she straightened and looked at Ethan's face. The blood, the dust, the missing glove, the 1,000-yard exhaustion already trying to settle into his eyes. "You look terrible," she said. Ethan glanced at her. "You always know what to say." Lucas laughed once and immediately regretted it, hand going to his ribs. The sound broke the tension just enough for everyone to remember they were still alive. Lena knelt by Ethan's hand, turned it over gently, and frowned at the raw skin where cold and metal had stripped it. "You're lucky you still have feeling." "Do I?" "Barely." Shadow pressed against Ethan's leg, then hard enough to matter. Ethan rested his uninjured hand on the dog's head and left it there a second longer than usual. "Good work," he said quietly. Shadow's ears flicked back once, accepting what needed no embellishment. They got moving fast after that because the ridge road had become its own kind of emergency. Wind drove snow sideways across the shelf, erasing tracks before they could fully form. The vehicles rocked in gusts. Below the hatch site, the mountain wore on as if none of this mattered. Endless trees, whitecuts, distant stone. The county convoy descended in low gear, Maria leading, Lucas in the middle unit with the recovered dogs and the injured casualty, Ethan in the rear vehicle with the prisoner and Shadow. Lena moved between radios from the front seat, cataloging evidence, status, and probable warrants, with a kind of icy focus that meant she would not sleep until every loose end was nailed down. By the time they reached the paved county road, dawn had broken properly over the eastern ridge. The world looked deceptively clean. Days later, when the immediate reports were written and the first state investigators had already started pulling records, warrants, and property maps, Ethan finally stood still long enough to feel the aftermath. The operation spread wider than any of them had guessed that first morning at the lookout. The tunnel had been one arm of a moving network, stolen K9S, unregistered security dogs, sedated transport through weather-protected routes, and high-value contraband piggybacking on the same infrastructure. The captured suspect talked once he realized the mountain hadn't finished what his employers started. Other arrests followed, not all at once, not neatly, but enough. Enough to matter. One recovered shepherd turned out to have been taken from a private detection contractor in Idaho. The Malinois had vanished from a training yard in Wyoming 3 weeks earlier. Both survived. Lucas spent 2 nights at County Medical with bruised ribs, smoke inhalation, and a renewed respect for orders he used to interpret as suggestions. He wore the humility badly at first, then better. When Ethan visited, Lucas looked at him for a long second and said, I know you sent me out because it was the right call." Ethan leaned against the wall of the room, arms folded. And I still hated it." "That means you're normal." Lucas shook his head. "I thought courage was going deeper." Ethan glanced toward the window where the mountains rose blue and indifferent beyond town. "Sometimes it is. Sometimes courage is leaving when the mission changes." Lucas sat with that. Then he nodded. "Shadow knew before I did." "Usually." Maria predictably did not celebrate. She reorganized. 2 weeks after the tunnel rescue, she called Ethan into her office. Her desk was covered in maps, budget sheets, and printed proposals. Outside her window, the county lot was thawing into late-season mud. "You've got a problem," Ethan said. She looked up. "I've got several. One of them is you." He waited. Maria slid a folder across the desk. On the cover, Gallatin Mountain, K-9 Search and Rescue Initiative. Ethan didn't touch it yet. Maria leaned back in her chair. "State wants an interagency training pilot after the tunnel case. Search, avalanche response, wilderness suspect tracking, rescue access. Dogs that can work terrain, and handlers who can think without supervision. You already have SAR. Not like this." He said nothing. Maria's eyes stayed on him. "You and Shadow did in that mountain what a 6-man technical team might not have finished in time. You can keep pretending that was just one good night, or you can help me build something useful out of it." Ethan looked down at the folder. He knew what she was really offering. Not a promotion exactly, not a reward, a return. A role that would put him back into responsibility permanently, not just on calls when the county needed his particular mix of patience, tactical thinking, and silence. A life with weight on it again. He had spent a long time convincing himself that distance was peace. That if he stayed disciplined enough, useful enough, controlled enough, he could keep grief in one room of himself and duty in another and never let the doors open at the same time. The mountain had disproved that. Not with revelation, not with anything sentimental. With necessity. With Shadow's body slamming into a shooter because hesitation would have killed them. With Lucas carrying 2 terrified dogs and a wounded man because leaving had become the brave thing. With Maria refusing to lose people just to flatter heroics. With Lena talking him through a bomb by intellect and trust across failing comms. He picked up the folder. "When do we start?" Maria did not smile broadly. She wasn't built for that. But something eased at the corner of her mouth. "Monday." Spring came late to the high country, but it came. Snow withdrew from the lower slopes in broken patches first, revealing wet grass, dark earth, and all the discarded evidence of winter. Snapped branches, flattened brush, old tracks turned to melt-sunk impressions. Up high, the ridges stayed white. Down in the valley, people rolled open garage doors and forgot how close the mountains always remained. On a cold, bright morning near the county training grounds, Ethan stood beside a new line of equipment stacked on a tailgate. Harnesses, avalanche beacons, long lines, trauma kits, and collars tagged for active rescue assignment. Lucas wrestled with a crate of cones 20 yards away, trying unsuccessfully to make the task look dignified. Lena stood by a folding table, calibrating a sensor unit with the same seriousness she brought to autopsy reports. Maria was on her phone, already arguing with someone about funding. Shadow sat at Ethan's side, alert and composed. Not just his partner now, anchor, standard, proof of concept. Beyond the fence, 2 recovered dogs worked a low obedience pattern with a state trainer. Neither was ready for field duty yet, maybe never would be. But they were alive, safe, moving forward. Ethan watched them for a while. Then he looked out toward the mountain line. Purpose, he had learned, did not arrive as a feeling. It arrived as a choice, repeated until it became a life. Shadow leaned gently against his knee. Ethan scratched once behind the dog's ear, then picked up the first training harness and turned toward the field. "Let's build it right," he said. Shadow rose before the last word left his mouth.